What if the person closest to you tried to have you killed, and you found out in the most shocking way possible? Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't believe. The night was quiet, a dim hotel room in Burundi, the air heavy with the weight of a long day. Noella Rukundo sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the phone in her hand. The funeral had drained her, the grief of losing her stepmother still fresh. She sighed, rubbing her temples, when the phone rang. Her husband, Balenga Kalala. She answered, her voice soft, tired. "I'm going to bed," she told him. But he hesitated. His voice, usually calm, carried something else that night. "Already?" "It's early. You should step outside for some fresh air before sleeping," he said. She thought about it for a moment. It was a strange suggestion, but he was her husband. She trusted him. Why wouldn't she? She grabbed a shawl, wrapped it around herself, and stepped into the night. The air was cooler than she expected. The hotel courtyard was quiet, only the distant hum of traffic and muffled voices from open windows breaking the silence. She walked slowly, letting the night air wash over her, easing the tension in her muscles. Then, something shifted. A presence. A shadow moving where there shouldn't have been one. Before she could react, strong hands gripped her arms. A jolt of fear shot through her as another set of hands seized her from behind. Her heart pounded. A voice, low and firm, whispered near her ear. "Don't scream!" Panic surged through her. She struggled, but the grip tightened. Then, darkness. A bag slipped over her head. She was yanked forward, her feet barely touching the ground. A door creaked. A shove. She tumbled into the back of a car. The door slammed shut. The engine roared. They were moving. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the fabric of the bag pressing against her face with each desperate inhale. She fought to steady herself. "This is a mistake," she tried to say, but her voice wavered. A chuckle. One of the men in the car spoke. "No mistake. We know exactly who you are." Her blood turned to ice. The ride was long. The car bumped along rough roads, her body jolting with each movement. She had no sense of time, no idea where they were taking her. Fear coiled around her like a vice. Then a sudden stop. The car doors opened. Hands grabbed her again, dragging her out. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, gravel, and then light. The bag was ripped from her head. She blinked, her vision adjusting. 3 men stood in front of her. Their faces were unreadable, their expressions cold. One of them, taller than the rest, pulled out a phone. He dialed a number. The ringing seemed to stretch forever. Then, a click, a voice she knew. "Is it done?" Her breath caught. No, it couldn't be. The man with the phone glanced at her, then spoke. "We have her." The man at the other end of the phone continued, "Kill her." The world tilted. Her knees buckled, her breath hitching in her throat. The words didn't make sense. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But it was. She barely heard the men speaking, discussing where to dump her body. The shock crashed over her like a wave, drowning her in fear. The ground felt unsteady. The night stretched into an eternity. And then, darkness. She collapsed. The last thing she heard was their voices, fading into the night. A dull ache throbbed in her skull. The world around her was blurry, the air thick with the scent of sweat and gasoline. Noella Rukundo's body felt heavy, her limbs weak. She didn't know how long she had been unconscious, only that when she opened her eyes, she wasn't where she had been before. The room was dim, a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows along the cracked walls. The cold bite of metal pressed against her wrists. Her hands were tied. Her ankles, too. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. Then, movement. A door creaked open. Footsteps. Heavy. Purposeful. She froze, her pulse pounding so loudly in her ears that she thought they could hear it. A figure stepped into the light. Then another. And another. 3 men. Their faces were shadowed, unreadable. One of them, the tallest, took a step forward, tilting his head as he studied her. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak, though her voice came out as little more than a whisper. Why are you doing this?" The tall man exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. Her heart clenched. He dialed a number, then put the phone on speaker. The ringing stretched out, endless, until finally, someone answered. A voice came through the speaker. A voice she knew. A voice that should have been comforting. Her husband. "Is it done?" he asked, his tone casual, as if he were inquiring about the weather. Nola's breath caught in her throat. The tall man turned his head slightly toward her, his gaze never leaving her face. "We have her," he said. A pause. Then her husband's voice again. "Kill her." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Noella felt the world shift beneath her, her stomach twisting. The voice, Belenga's voice, was real. This was real. A strangled sound escaped her lips. A plea. A denial. "No. No, he wouldn't." But he would. He did. The tall man ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He turned to the others. "Where should we dump her?" The room tilted. Her body trembled violently, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She struggled against the ropes, her mind screaming at her to do something, to fight, to run. But there was nowhere to go. She wasn't meant to leave this place alive. The men spoke in hushed tones, their words slipping through her consciousness like smoke. She caught fragments. "Quiet spot. No cameras. Make it quick." Nola tried to speak, tried to beg, but the words tangled in her throat. Her mind was spinning. Was this how it would end? Then, one of them laughed, a short, dry chuckle. She flinched. The tall man turned back to her, his gaze softer now, amused. "You're lucky," he said, crouching down so that they were at eye level. "We don't kill women and children." The words took a moment to sink in. She blinked, her mind grasping at them, trying to make sense of what he was saying. He stood straightening his jacket. "But that doesn't mean you're free," he added. "Not yet." A new kind of fear took root inside her. What did they mean? What were they going to do? The men untied her ankles, yanked her to her feet. Her legs wobbled beneath her. "Walk," one of them ordered. She hesitated. A sharp shove to her shoulder sent her stumbling forward. The room spun as they pushed her through a narrow hallway and out into the night. Cold air hit her skin. The dark outline of trees loomed ahead. Gravel crunched beneath her bare feet. A car sat nearby, engine idling. They forced her inside. The drive was long. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken threats. Noella's mind raced. Why were they keeping her alive? If they weren't going to kill her, then what? The answer came when they finally stopped. A secluded spot. Trees surrounded them, their dark branches swaying against the moonlit sky. The men got out. One of them turned, tossing something into her lap. A small rectangular object. A memory card. "For proof," he said simply. She looked up at him, confusion flickering across her face. "Proof of what?" she whispered. The man smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "That your husband tried to kill you." Her heart slammed against her ribs. The tall man stepped forward, his voice steady. "We got what we wanted from him. Now it's your turn." A pause, then softer, almost gentle. "Go home, Noella, and show him that ghosts don't stay buried." The car door opened. Noella stepped out on unsteady legs. The men didn't follow. She turned, glancing over her shoulder. They were already walking back to the car. Then, one last voice drifting through the air. "Don't waste this chance." The car pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the darkness. And Noella was alone. Noella Rukundo sat in silence. The weight of the memory card pressed against her palm, small but powerful. The truth was there, captured in the cold, emotionless voice of the man she had trusted, the man she had loved. The plane ride home was long. The hum of the engine droned in the background, but her mind was elsewhere. Every second brought her closer to him, to the moment she would stand before him, alive when he had believed her buried. She watched the city lights appear beneath her as the plane descended, a return that was never meant to happen, a homecoming from the dead. Soft rustling of fabric, the murmur of voices, the clinking of glass. The funeral was in full swing. Mourners moved in and out of the house, whispering words of comfort, shaking hands, embracing. Faces were wet with tears. The air was thick with sorrow. A man stood in the center of it all. Balenga Kalala. His shoulders were heavy with grief, his face solemn. He accepted condolences with a practiced nod, hands clasped tightly together. People handed him money, an offering of support. His wife had died, and yet she hadn't. Noella sat in the car watching. Her fingers tapped lightly against the door handle. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. Then she stepped out. The night air wrapped around her like a whisper, cool and unforgiving. Each step was measured, deliberate. The gravel shifted beneath her feet. Mourners passed her, their heads down, their bodies wrapped in sorrow. They didn't notice her, not yet. Then he turned. Balenga Kalala's gaze landed on her. His expression froze. A sharp inhale, a flicker of disbelief. Nola took another step forward. His breath came in short gasps. His body swayed as if the ground beneath him had shifted. His lips parted. A whisper. "Is it my eyes?" She tilted her head slightly, her voice smooth, unwavering. "Is it a ghost?" he choked out. A pause. Then, "Surprise," she said softly. "I'm still alive." Balenga stumbled backward, his hands shaking. His eyes darted from side to side, searching for something. An escape, an answer, a way out. Noella didn't move. You're dead," he stammered. Her gaze stayed steady. "You tried to kill me." The murmurs around them slowed, heads turned, faces registered the impossible. A woman who should not be standing there. A widow who was not a widow. Balenga's lips trembled. "Noella, She reached into her pocket. The memory card. The receipts. She held them up, letting the weight of them sink into his skin. "You lied to them," she said. "You told them I was gone. You stood in our home and took their pity, took their money, and you thought you would get away with it." His breathing turned ragged. His fingers twitched. "Noella, listen." "Don't." He flinched. Her voice was calm, steady, but behind it, a storm brewed. She let the silence stretch, let him feel it. Then softly, "I called the police." His body tensed. Sirens wailed in the distance. Balenga turned his head sharply, eyes wild. His breath hitched. Flashing lights appeared down the street. No escape. A door slammed. Footsteps. Uniformed officers stepping forward. His body jerked, an instinct to run, but there was nowhere to go. The weight of his crimes pressed down on him. Handcuffs clicked into place. Balenga Kalala, the grieving husband, the liar, the murderer who never got to finish the job, was taken away. Balenga Kalala did not fight. His body had gone rigid, his breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. The officers moved with practiced efficiency, their hands firm but steady as they secured his wrists behind his back. The weight of the steel pressed into his skin. A moment ago, he had been the grieving husband, surrounded by family, by sympathy, by lies. Now he was nothing. The murmurs around them grew. Some gasped, others whispered. A woman covered her mouth with her hands, eyes wide with disbelief. Noella Rukundo stood still, watching. The moment stretched between them. Balenga turned his head, his eyes locking onto hers. Desperate. "Noella!" His voice cracked, dry and raw. "Please," she said nothing. The officers pulled him toward the waiting police car. His feet stumbled. The gravel shifted beneath him, loose and uncertain, just like the life he thought he had secured. He tried again. "Noella, please!" His voice grew louder, strained. She blinked, slowly. "You were supposed to be dead," he whispered. Noella exhaled, the cool night air filling her lungs. "And yet," she tilted her head. "Here I am," a sharp tug on his arm. The officers guided him into the back seat of the police car. The door slammed shut. His face disappeared behind the glass. Then, the car pulled away, and Balenga Kalala was gone. The trial began months later. The evidence was undeniable. The recordings, the Western Union receipts, the testimony of the hitmen themselves, men who had been willing to kill, but not willing to die for a liar like him. Balenga sat in the courtroom, his hands folded in his lap. His face was blank. A mask. But Noela saw it. The cracks beneath the surface, the twitch in his jaw, the tension in his shoulders, the weight of fear pressing down on him. He had lost control. She had taken it back. The judge's voice rang through the courtroom, clear and unshaken. This was a calculated act. Had Ms. Rukundo's kidnappers completed the job, 8 children would have lost their mother. The words struck like a hammer. Belenga flinched. It was premeditated and motivated by unfounded jealousy, anger, and a desire to punish Miss Rukundo, the judge continued. And for that, a pause, then the sentence. 9 years in prison. Silence. Noela let out a slow breath. Not relief, not joy, just finality. Belenga's head dropped forward, his hands clenched into fists. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. The officers approached. His body stiffened as the cuffs clicked around his wrists once more. Noela watched as they led him away. This time, he did not call her name. He did not beg. There was nothing left to say. A faint breeze rustles through the leaves, the soft, rhythmic tapping of rain against a window pane. Noela Rukundo stood by her window, watching the sky shift from deep blue to the soft glow of morning. A new day. She had lived through the unthinkable. She had walked through the fire and emerged, not unscathed, but standing. Belenga was behind bars, and she was free. Her past, gone, her future, waiting. She turned away from the window, exhaling softly. Then she stepped forward toward her new life.